In the silent realms of ancient Greece, where gods dictated fate with ruthless abandon, a single mortal woman's beauty became her greatest curse. Medusa, a priestess once blessed with divine allure, would be transformed into a monster by the very goddess she worshipped. Betrayed by Poseidon's lust and Athena's wrath, Medusa's life was shattered in an instant. Her beauty, once her greatest gift, became the weapon that sealed her fate. Her story is one of tragedy, vengeance, and an irreversible transformation, one that echoes through time as a haunting reminder of the capricious nature of the gods.
In the quiet stillness of ancient Greece, where myths were born from whispers on the wind and the gods roamed the heavens with capricious gaze, there was a story that would echo through time, leaving behind a legacy both haunting and tragic. This is a tale of Medusa, a figure whose myth has woven itself into the fabric of our collective consciousness. With a beauty so extraordinary it captivated all who laid eyes upon her, yet a curse so cruel it rendered her a monster, feared and misunderstood. Imagine, if you will, a time long before the myths of heroes and quests for glory. Picture a world where gods and mortals were entwined in a delicate dance, sometimes friends, sometimes enemies, but always intertwined in the fate of the other. Amid this intricate web of divine influence lived a woman, a mortal who held the world in her gaze, her beauty unparalleled. She was Medusa, a name whispered on the winds, a woman whose beauty made her a subject of envy among gods and men alike. In those days, beauty was more than skin deep. It was a power, an asset that could elevate a mortal to the heights of the divine. Medusa was no ordinary woman. Her beauty was said to rival that of Aphrodite herself, the goddess of love and beauty. Her golden locks shimmered in the sun. Her eyes sparkled with a light that could captivate even the coldest hearts. Her skin was as flawless as marble, a delicate shade of porcelain that seemed to glow with an otherworldly radiance. Those who saw her were drawn to her, unable to look away, as though her very presence was a divine blessing, something otherworldly. But beauty, as Medusa would come to learn, is a double-edged sword. In a world where the gods often sought to bend the wills of mortals to their own whims, beauty could be both a gift and a curse. For Medusa, her beauty became the object of a divine obsession, and it was this obsession that would eventually lead to her tragic fate. Medusa's story began, as many do, with a single moment, a single event that would alter the course of her life forever. It is here that we find the gods, not as distant figures watching from the heavens, but as active participants in the lives of mortals. The gods of Mount Olympus, powerful and capricious, had an influence that stretched far beyond the mortal realm. They were both vengeful and loving, generous and cruel, depending on the whims of the moment. Among the gods, Poseidon, the god of the sea, was known for his impulsive nature, his insatiable desires, and his often reckless pursuit of beauty. He was not one to admire from afar. If he desired something, he would take it. And so, when Poseidon laid eyes on Medusa, it was not enough for him to admire her from a distance. He wanted her, and so he pursued her with a single-minded intensity that would lead to ruin. But Medusa, unlike the others who were easily charmed by the gods' advances, had vowed herself to a life of service. She had been a priestess in Athena's temple, a sacred role that demanded purity and devotion. She had sworn to remain untouched by the desires of men, to live a life devoted to Athena and to the goddess's teachings. Her beauty, while admired by many, had been a symbol of her devotion to Athena, not a means of seduction. Yet the gods, especially Poseidon, could not be dissuaded by such vows. On one fateful day, Poseidon, driven by his relentless desire, entered Athena's temple, where Medusa was performing her sacred duties. The temple, meant to be a place of purity and reverence, became the site of a violation that would change Medusa forever. It is said that Poseidon took Medusa by force, a violation that would stain both the temple and Medusa's life in ways that no mortal could understand. Her sacred vow, her purity, was shattered in an instant, and the consequences of this violation would be felt not only by her, but by the gods themselves. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, did not look kindly on the desecration of her temple, and she, too, turned her gaze upon Medusa, but it was not with the eyes of compassion. Athena, in her rage, blamed Medusa for what had occurred. In her mind, Medusa's beauty had been the cause of Poseidon's desire, and it was Medusa's fault that the temple had been defiled. There was no mercy in Athena's eyes, no understanding of the pain that Medusa had endured. Instead, there was only wrath. And so, Medusa's life took a turn that would forever separate her from the world she once knew. Athena, in her anger, cursed Medusa, transforming her into a creature that was no longer human, no longer beautiful. Her hair, once golden and radiant, became a mass of writhing serpents. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, became windows to a soul tormented by pain and isolation. Those who met her gaze would be turned to stone, frozen in an eternal moment of fear. The beauty that had once been her greatest gift had now become her greatest curse. This transformation was not one of choice. It was not a gift that Medusa had sought, but rather a punishment that she had been forced to bear. In the blink of an eye, Medusa went from being one of the most beautiful women in the world to a monstrous figure, feared and reviled by all who saw her. The world that had once admired her beauty now feared her. No longer would she walk freely among mortals. Instead, she would be exiled to a remote island where she could no longer harm anyone with her gaze. Medusa's story is often told as a cautionary tale of divine retribution, a story that highlights the cruel and capricious nature of the gods. But within this myth lies a deeper truth. Medusa was not the instigator of her own tragedy. She was a victim of the gods, a mortal caught in the crossfire of divine conflict. And yet, despite her victimhood, it was Medusa who would bear the brunt of the punishment. She would carry the weight of the gods' cruelty on her shoulders, her beauty twisted into a monstrous form, her humanity stripped away. But even in her cursed state, Medusa was not without agency. She became a symbol of power, of fear, and of the complexities of victimhood. In a world where the gods held absolute power over mortals, Medusa's story is a reminder that beauty and power are not always a blessing. Sometimes they come at a price, and the price is often higher than one could ever imagine. As the story of Medusa unfolds, it becomes clear that her tragedy is not just a personal one, but a reflection of the larger themes of Greek mythology. In a world where the gods are fickle and the lines between justice and vengeance are blurred, Medusa's curse becomes a symbol of the ways in which power can corrupt and destroy. Her beauty, which once brought her admiration, now only brought her suffering. Her transformation into a monster was not a simple punishment, but a manifestation of the divine wrath that seemed to follow mortals wherever they went. And so, the story of Medusa serves as a reminder of the dangers of beauty, of power, and of the whims of the gods. It is a story that transcends time, one that continues to resonate with those who seek to understand the complexities of fate and the divine. Medusa's curse, like all myths, serves as both a warning and a reflection of the human condition, reminding us that even the most innocent and beautiful among us can be subjected to cruelty of a world beyond our control. In the end, Medusa's story is not just a tale of a woman turned monster, but a narrative that echoes the eternal struggle between mortals and the gods, between beauty and power, innocence and guilt, punishment and redemption. It is a story that remains as relevant today as it was in ancient Greece, a myth that continues to captivate our imaginations, even as it leaves us with a sense of sadness and awe. Medusa's origins, like many figures of ancient myth, are shrouded in mystery, and yet there is a story beneath the layers of time that paints a picture of a woman whose life, once filled with promise and beauty, would be transformed into a tragic tale of divine punishment. Before the serpents coiled upon her head, before her gaze could freeze even the most fearless of men, Medusa was a mortal woman, known far and wide for her astonishing beauty. In a world where gods and mortals were inextricably linked, where the fate of human lives often rested in the hands of immortal beings, Medusa's story began in a far more innocent place. Before the gods took their interest in her, before her life was changed forever. Born in the ancient city of Epidaurus, Medusa was not initially the object of fear and myth. Rather, she was simply a young woman, radiant and full of life, living among the mortals. Her beauty was unparalleled, a gift that set her apart from others, but one that she bore with grace and dignity. She was the daughter of Perseus and Ceto, ancient sea deities who ruled over the deepest and most mysterious parts of the ocean. Though she came from divine lineage, she was mortal, with all the joys and struggles that life as a mortal entailed. Her beauty was not just skin-deep, though. It was said to reflect her inner purity, her gentle nature, and her devotion to the gods. Medusa's early life was one of simplicity, spent in the quiet serenity of the temple. From a young age, she was drawn to the sacred halls of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. It was there that Medusa found her calling, dedicating herself to a life of devotion and service to the goddess. As a priestess of Athena, she vowed to remain chaste, to protect the sanctity of the temple, and to serve the goddess with unwavering loyalty. In the temple, Medusa found purpose, her beauty an afterthought in comparison to the sacredness of her duties. Her life was one of discipline, peace, and respect for the divine. To understand the full scope of Medusa's transformation, we must first appreciate the world she inhabited, a world in which beauty was not only revered but also feared. In Greek mythology, beauty was often seen as a reflection of divine favor, something that could elevate a mortal to the highest of places or lead them to the deepest of downfalls. Medusa's beauty in its purity was a rare gift, a reflection of the divine, something to be admired by those who had the eyes to see it. But it was also a potential danger. For in a world where the gods looked upon mortals with a mixture of envy and desire, beauty was as much a curse as it was a blessing. Athena, the goddess Medusa had pledged herself to, was known for her wisdom and impartiality. She was a protector of the city and a goddess of justice, but her virtues did not extend to all mortals equally. Athena was a goddess of contradictions. Her wisdom was vast, but her capacity for mercy was limited. For Medusa, who had dedicated her life to the service of this very goddess, Athena's favor should have been guaranteed. But in the world of Greek mythology, there was no room for certainty. The gods were unpredictable, and their judgments often seemed as arbitrary as they were final. Medusa's beauty, which had been the pride of her mortal existence, would soon become the source of her undoing. It was Poseidon, the god of the sea, who first set his eyes upon Medusa. Like many of the gods, Poseidon was known for his impulsive and often destructive behavior. He was a god driven by desire, and when he saw Medusa's radiant beauty, he could not resist. The stories vary, but it is said that Poseidon's lustful pursuit of Medusa was relentless, and despite her status as a priestess of Athena, a woman sworn to chastity, he would not be denied. His intentions, driven by divine will and personal passion, led him to seek Medusa out in the very temple she had vowed to serve. In those ancient times, the gods did not abide by the laws of men, and they did not respect the sacred vows that mortals held dear. They were not bound by moral codes, and their desires were as uncontrollable as the forces of nature itself. Poseidon, in his pursuit of Medusa, entered the temple of Athena, the very place she had dedicated herself to. The temple, a sacred space where mortals and gods alike could seek refuge in divine favor, became the stage for a violent act that would set Medusa's fate in motion. In this moment of violation, the boundaries between divine and mortal were shattered. The details of what transpired in the temple are often left vague, but the consequences of that moment are clear. Medusa, who had once been a woman of purity, devoted to Athena and the gods, was now forever changed. The gods, ever fickle in their actions, did not look kindly upon the violation. Athena, who had once been the goddess to whom Medusa had pledged her loyalty, would now turn her wrath upon the mortal woman. Medusa's transformation was swift and final, a punishment inflicted by Athena herself, one that would strip Medusa of her humanity and leave her as a symbol of divine wrath. But Medusa's transformation was not merely physical. It was psychological, emotional, and spiritual. She had once been a woman with dreams and hopes, living a life dedicated to the service of the goddess Athena. Now, she was cast out, no longer a woman but a monster. Athena, in her fury, cursed Medusa, changing her into a Gorgon, a creature with snakes for her hair and a gaze that could turn anyone who looked into her eyes to stone. The beauty that had once been her most celebrated feature was now the source of her curse. Medusa's radiant golden hair, once a symbol of her purity and devotion, was transformed into a mass of writhing serpents, a grotesque reflection of the punishment she had received. Medusa's curse was not just a punishment for her actions, but a reflection of the cruelty of the gods, who often held mortals responsible for the actions of divine beings. Her beauty, the very gift that set her apart from other mortals, was now her burden to bear. No longer could she walk freely in the world, her gaze now a weapon of fear and death. The gods had taken everything from her, the love she had once known, her beauty, her humanity. In an instant, Medusa's life was irreparably altered, and she was cast into a life of isolation, exile, and torment. As Medusa retreated to the remote island where she would spend the rest of her days, her story became one of legend, a tragic tale of a woman whose beauty had drawn the attention of the gods, only to result in her transformation into a monster. The myths of Medusa, as they were passed down through generations, would come to symbolize the fragility of mortal life and the unpredictable nature of divine power. Her beauty, once a gift, had become a curse, and the gods, in their infinite power, had left her to suffer alone. But even in the depths of her isolation, Medusa was not without agency. Her curse, though tragic, made her a figure of power. Her gaze, which had once captivated all who looked upon her, was now a weapon that could turn the bravest of men into statues of stone. Though Medusa's humanity had been stripped from her, she had become a figure to be reckoned with, a creature both feared and revered. The world that had once adored her beauty now feared her power, and her story became one of tragedy, vengeance, and the eternal consequences of divine intervention. Medusa's origins are marked by innocence, beauty, and devotion, but her transformation into a Gorgon is a stark reminder of the volatility of the gods, the unpredictability of fate, and the fragile nature of human existence. In the end, Medusa's story is not just a tale of a woman cursed by the gods. It is a reflection of the human condition, a story of power, beauty, and the deep, often cruel, consequences of divine judgment. The Medusa myth is both a victim and a symbol. Her tale, a timeless reminder how even the most innocent among us can be swept away by forces beyond our control. In the heart of Greek mythology, where gods and mortals often cross paths in unpredictable and fateful encounters, there existed a constant tension between the divine and the human. The gods, in their infinite power, looked down on the mortal world with a mix of amusement, disdain, and occasionally love. However, these gods were capricious, often acting out of jealousy, desire, or boredom, as if their very nature required them to meddle in the lives of those who inhabited the earth. Medusa's story, so intricately tied to the gods, was no exception. The tale of her transformation from a beautiful priestess to the monster we know today was not merely the result of a single god's wrath, but rather a combination of divine forces that acted upon her in ways that were both unexpected and unforgiving. The spark that set Medusa's tragic fate into motion came from none other than Poseidon, the god of the sea. Poseidon was a god unlike any other in the Greek pantheon. With his trident, he ruled over the seas, the storms, and the oceans, his power as vast as the waters he controlled. His presence was often felt in the crashing waves and the thunderous roars of the deep. But Poseidon was not just a god of the ocean. He was also a god of passion, impulse, and desire. Like many of the gods of Mount Olympus, Poseidon was driven by his own whims, and when he saw something he desired, he would stop at nothing to possess it. His desires were not bound by mortal conventions of right and wrong. To Poseidon, the notion of consent was a concept alien to his divine nature. If he wanted something, he took it, regardless of the consequences. And so, it was that Medusa, whose beauty had already garnered the attention of countless mortals, caught the eye of Poseidon. Medusa was a priestess of Athena, a woman who had devoted her life to the goddess of wisdom, purity, and war. She had sworn a vow of chastity, and her life was one of quiet devotion and service to the goddess, away from the temptations and distractions of the mortal world. Athena's temple was a place of sanctuary, where Medusa could live in peace, untouched by the desires of men. But Poseidon, driven by a lustful obsession, would not let such vows deter him. He was a god of power, and in his mind, nothing was beyond his reach, not even a sacred vow made to another goddess. The first meeting between Poseidon and Medusa is clouded in myth and legend, but the essence of the story remains the same. Poseidon, unable to resist his growing desire for the beautiful priestess, approached her with the full force of his divine presence. Whether it was by charm or by force, Poseidon's pursuit of Medusa was relentless. The sea god was known for his aggressive nature, and when his desires were not met, he often resorted to force. It is said that Poseidon, in his pursuit of Medusa, entered Athena's temple, desecrating the sacred space with his presence. The very place where Medusa had sworn her vows of chastity, where she had dedicated her life to service and purity, was now the site of a violation that would alter her destiny forever. The moment was one of great violence, both physical and spiritual. In the temple, the walls that had once stood as symbols of divine protection now became the backdrop for an act of divine disregard. Medusa, though immortal, was powerless in the face of Poseidon's overwhelming strength. Her beauty, which had once been a gift, now became the object of the god's obsession. In an instant, her life was changed. The very sanctuary she had sought in Athena's temple was no longer a place of peace, but a space tainted by the actions of a god who saw no boundaries between divine will and mortal life. Poseidon took Medusa against her will, and the consequences of this moment would reverberate throughout the ages. Yet, it was not Poseidon's actions alone that shaped Medusa's fate. Athena, the goddess to whom Medusa had pledged herself, was quick to learn of the violation. As a goddess of wisdom and strategy, Athena would not tolerate such desecration, especially not within her own temple. Athena was known for her wisdom, but she was also a goddess of war, and her wrath could be swift and unforgiving. However, what followed was not an act of justice or compassion, but a decision that would forever mark Medusa's life with cruelty and despair. Instead of condemning Poseidon for his actions, Athena chose to punish Medusa. In a moment of divine rage and jealousy, Athena directed her anger not at the god who had wronged Medusa, but at the victim herself. The goddess of wisdom, in her infinite power, turned her fury upon the mortal who had been violated. She transformed Medusa into a Gorgon, a creature no longer human form, but a being of monstrosity. Her beautiful golden hair was transformed into writhing snakes, and her once vibrant eyes became the instruments of death, capable of turning any mortal who gazed upon them into stone. What had once been a symbol of her divine beauty was now a curse, a grotesque reflection of the wrath of the gods. Athena's decision to punish Medusa instead of Poseidon highlights a critical aspect of the divine nature in Greek mythology. The gods were not bound by the rules of justice as mortals understood them. They were driven by their own whims, their emotions, and their sense of superiority over the mortal world. Medusa, who had been a devoted servant of Athena, now found herself at the mercy of a goddess who saw fit to punish her for the actions of a god. This divine cruelty was a reflection of the arbitrary nature of the gods and their lack of empathy for the suffering of mortals. The transformation that Medusa underwent was not merely physical. It was a deep, soul-wrenching change that stripped away everything she had known. No longer could she walk freely among mortals, admired for her beauty and grace. No longer could she serve as a priestess of Athena, living a life of devotion and purpose. Medusa was cast out, exiled to a remote island far from the reach of both gods and men, where she could no longer harm anyone with her gaze. But the curse was not just an isolation from others. It was a spiritual exile as well. Medusa, once a symbol of divine favor and beauty, was now a symbol of divine wrath and punishment, a living reminder of the god's ability to reshape the lives of mortals with a single act. In her exile, Medusa's life was defined by loneliness and sorrow. The very beauty that had once drawn people to her was now the source of her isolation. No longer could she enjoy the company of others, for all who looked upon her were turned to stone. She had become a monster in the eyes of the world, a creature feared and reviled. Even the gods, who had once admired her beauty, now turned their backs on her, seeing her only as a danger, a symbol of their own anger and retribution. Medusa's story, however, is not just one of victimhood. The transformation she underwent also brought with it a strange, twisted power. The very curse that had turned her into a monster also made her one of the most powerful creatures in Greek mythology. Her gaze could turn the strongest of men into lifeless statues, and her presence could instill fear in the hearts of those who dared to approach her. In a way, Medusa became a figure of strength, a creature whose very existence commanded respect and fear. But this power came at a great cost. It was a power that isolated her, that kept her from ever truly living a life of her own. It was a power that forced her to become a monster in the eyes of others, even though she had done nothing to deserve such a fate. The gods, with their fickle nature, had turned Medusa from a beautiful mortal woman into a monster whose name would forever be associated with terror and tragedy. But even in her monstrous form, Medusa's humanity remained buried deep within her. In a world where the gods had the power to shape the fates of mortals, Medusa's story is a reminder of the cruelty that could be wrought upon the innocent, and a way that even beauty and purity could be transformed into something monstrous in the hands of the divine. Poseidon's role in Medusa's transformation is pivotal. While the sea god's desire for Medusa set the stage for her fall, it was Athena's wrath that ultimately sealed her fate. Poseidon's actions were driven by a primal, godly instinct, but Athena's decision was cold, calculated, and final. In the world of Greek mythology, the gods were the ultimate arbiters of fate, and their decisions were often not based on notions of fairness or justice, but on their own capricious natures. Medusa's transformation, as tragic as it was not just a result of Poseidon's lust, but also the divine interplay between gods who saw mortals as little more than playthings for their amusement. The gods could create, destroy, and reshape the lives of mortals with a single thought, and in Medusa's case, their actions turned her from a beautiful priestess into a cursed creature, forever trapped in a cycle of loneliness and power. Her story, like so many in Greek mythology, serves as a reminder of the fragility of mortal existence, the unpredictable cruelty of the gods, and the way in which beauty and power, when in the hands of the divine, can become burdens that no mortal could ever truly understand or control. Medusa's tale, though often remembered for its monstrous elements, is, at its core, a story of loss, of innocence stolen. The moment of Medusa's transformation was one of immense, painful change, both physical and emotional, that would reverberate throughout the entire scope of Greek mythology. When Athena, in her infinite anger, cursed Medusa, her world as she had known it was forever torn apart. The very essence of Medusa's identity, her beauty, was turned into a grotesque weapon. Medusa's hair, once golden and radiant like the rays of the sun, became a writhing mass of venomous snakes. Her soft, captivating gaze, which had once made men fall at her feet in admiration, became an instrument of death. Anyone who looked directly into her eyes would turn to stone, frozen forever in a moment of terror. The gods, in their capricious cruelty, had taken everything from her: her beauty, her purity, her humanity, and her place in the world. No longer could Medusa walk among mortals as a beautiful priestess of Athena, for now she was condemned to an existence as a monster, feared and isolated by all who came near her. Medusa's transformation was not merely a change in appearance, but a profound metamorphosis that reshaped every aspect of her life. The woman who had once walked in the sunlight, admired by all who gazed upon her, was now a creature of the night, shunned and rejected by the world she had known. Her beauty had been her greatest asset, a gift from the gods that elevated her to a position of admiration and respect. But it was also a curse, a double-edged sword that attracted the attention of gods and mortals alike, both of whom viewed her beauty through different lenses: admiration from one, desire from another, and, ultimately, envy and rage from the gods themselves. Now, with her hair transformed into serpents, Medusa no longer recognized herself. Her reflection, once an image of delicate grace, now appeared monstrous. The snakes that replaced her hair hissed and coiled, their venomous fangs dripping with poison. She could no longer walk the earth freely, for any mortal who looked upon her was doomed to be turned into stone, frozen in their tracks by the terror of her gaze. The mere sight of her became a death sentence, a reminder of the gods' cruelty and the consequences of divine wrath. Medusa's life, once filled with potential and promise, was now defined by pain and isolation. She was a prisoner of her own body, cursed to roam a desolate, isolated existence where no mortal dared approach her. And yet, even in the depths of her torment, Medusa's suffering was not only the result of her monstrous appearance, but the loss of her humanity. The world she had once known, one where she had devoted herself to Athena and the service of the gods, was now a distant memory, a past she could no longer return to. No longer could she serve in the temple. No longer could she offer prayers or tend to the sacred altar. She had been cast out, not only by the mortals who now feared her, but by the very goddess she had sworn allegiance to. Athena, once her protector, had become her tormentor, punishing her for a crime that was not hers to bear. Medusa's isolation was profound. She was exiled to a remote island, a place far from the reach of both gods and men, where she could no longer harm anyone with her gaze. But this exile was not a peaceful retreat. It was a living hell. Stripped of everything that had once defined her, Medusa now existed in a state of perpetual loneliness. The island, barren and desolate, became her prison. She wandered its shores, a figure of sorrow and rage, cut off from the world she had once been a part of. The only company she had were the snakes that now inhabited her scalp, their constant hissing a reminder of her new, monstrous form. It is in this solitude that Medusa's transformation took on deeper layers. Her physical appearance had been altered by the gods, but it was her emotional and psychological transformation that truly defined her. No longer able to find solace in the world of mortals, she became a creature of vengeance. Her isolation bred a bitter anger, a rage against the gods who had turned her life into a nightmare. The betrayal she felt from Athena, a goddess she had once adored, was a wound that never healed. Athena's punishment had been cruel and unjust, and it was this injustice that fueled Medusa's fury. She was not simply a monster cursed by the gods. She was a victim, a woman who had been wronged and forsaken by those who were supposed to protect her. The gods, in their wisdom, had failed to see the truth of Medusa's plight. Instead of offering compassion or mercy, they had chosen vengeance, casting her aside as a mere tool of their wrath. As Medusa roamed the island, she became something more than just a victim of divine cruelty. She became a symbol. Her curse, once a mark of beauty and grace, was now a symbol of power. The power to turn others to stone, to instill fear in the hearts of those who dared approach her. Her gaze, once a means of captivating and charming, now became a weapon of death. It was in this twisted version of her former self that Medusa's true power emerged. She no longer had to rely on her beauty to gain the attention of mortals. Now, her very existence struck terror into the hearts of those who dared to look upon her. The very thing that had once made her vulnerable, her beauty, had now been transformed into her greatest strength. But this power came at a great cost. She was no longer able to live a normal life. She was an outcast, feared and hunted by all who crossed her path. Medusa's curse, in a way, mirrored the fate of many figures in Greek mythology who were transformed into monsters as a result of the gods' whims. The gods, in their infinite power, were often blind to the suffering they caused, seeing mortals as little more than pawns in their divine games. Medusa's story was a tragic reminder of the dangers of beauty and the price that could be paid for being too desirable, too powerful in the eyes of the gods. The gods had taken her beauty and her humanity, and in return, they had created a being whose very existence was a reflection of their cruelty. Despite her transformation into a monster, Medusa's curse did not diminish her humanity. Beneath the layers of rage, sorrow, and bitterness, she remained a woman who had been deeply wronged. She was a victim of divine wrath, punished not for any crime she had committed, but for being the object of Poseidon's desire. The gods had failed to see the truth of her situation, that Medusa had been an innocent bystander in the gods' petty conflicts, a woman whose only fault was being too beautiful for her own good. And yet, it was she who had been punished, while the gods, with their limitless power, walked away unscathed. As time passed, Medusa's story became one of legend, a tragic myth that would be passed down through generations. She became a symbol of the consequences of divine cruelty, a cautionary tale about the dangers of beauty, power, and the capriciousness of the gods. But for Medusa, there was no redemption, no hope of release from her curse. She had been abandoned by the gods, left to suffer in isolation for eternity. Her transformation was not just physical. It was emotional and psychological. The woman who had once been full of life, radiating beauty and grace, was now a shadow of her former self. Her curse had taken everything from her, her beauty, her innocence, her humanity, and had left her with nothing but rage and despair. The gods had stripped her of her place in the world, leaving her with nothing but the power to destroy. In this sense, Medusa's curse was a reflection of the darker side of Greek mythology, the way in which the gods' whims could destroy the lives of mortals without reason or remorse. The gods were not bound by the same rules as mortals. They could shape the fates of others with a single thought, a single action, and often did so without regard for the consequences. Medusa's transformation into a monster was a cruel reminder of the power the gods held over mortals, and the price that could be paid for being the object of their desire or their wrath. But within Medusa's curse lay a deeper truth. Even in her isolation, even in her transformation into a monster, she remained a symbol of the human condition. She was a reflection of the suffering that so many mortals endure at the hands of the gods, suffering that was often arbitrary, unjust, and without explanation. Medusa's tragedy was not just her physical transformation, but her emotional and spiritual transformation as well. She had been a woman of beauty and grace, full of promise, but now she was a monster, defined not by her own actions but by the whims of the gods. And so, Medusa's curse became her identity, her existence bound to the sorrow and rage of the gods' cruelty. She was not merely a monster to be feared. She was a woman whose life had been shattered by forces beyond her control. And in this way, her story became not just a myth, but a reflection of the timeless struggle between mortals and gods, between the innocent and the all-powerful, and the heavy price that sometimes must be paid for the divine whims of the gods. As Medusa's tragic transformation took full hold, she became a symbol of isolation, grief, and vengeance, a creature that existed not merely in her physical form, but in a complex state of emotional and psychological torment. It is in the depths of this isolation that we truly begin to understand the complexities of her curse. Her existence, marked by solitude and rage, was a life spent in a kind of stasis, forever trapped in an inescapable cycle of despair. The gods had stripped her of everything: her beauty, her humanity, her place in the world, and her connection to the mortal realm. But the most crushing blow was the loss of agency, the ability to shape her own fate. She was no longer the woman she had once been, a beloved priestess of Athena, a woman whose beauty and grace had captured the admiration of gods and mortals alike. Now, she was a being feared by all, a monster who could not escape the prison the gods had built for her. Medusa's exile to the island of Sarpedon was not a simple act of banishment. It was a punishment that had been designed not just to punish her physically, but to strip her of everything she once knew, leaving her alone in a barren world that mirrored her internal torment. The island was not merely geographically remote. It was a place so desolate that even the gods would not approach. It was a place where Medusa would be utterly isolated, away from any mortal or divine company. And this isolation became the defining element of her existence. In her exile, Medusa's life became a long, lonely existence defined by the constant echo of her curse. Her form, no longer that of a beautiful mortal woman, became a reflection of the divine wrath that had shaped her fate, a grotesque reminder that the gods, in their unchecked power, could transform even the most innocent beings into monsters. At first, Medusa's mind was consumed by the devastation of her transformation. She was unable to comprehend the extent of her fall, the loss of everything she had once known. Her beauty, the very thing that had defined her, was now a source of revulsion. Her once innocent gaze had become lethal, and anyone who dared look into her eyes was immediately turned to stone. This transformation was not just physical, it was also psychological. Medusa could no longer recognize the woman she had been before. She had been turned into something monstrous, something no longer human in the eyes of the world. She was no longer the object of admiration. She was now a symbol of fear, of death, and of the gods' cruelty. She had become a figure to be avoided, a living curse, and the gods had condemned her to this fate with no hope of reprieve. And yet, despite the cruel reality of her transformation, Medusa's curse began to give birth to a different kind of power. This power was born from her isolation, her inability to relate to the world around her, and her unrelenting rage. The curse that stripped her of her humanity also endowed her with an incredible weapon: her gaze. Medusa could now petrify anyone who looked upon her, turning them into lifeless statues, forever frozen in a state of terror. The very thing that had once made her vulnerable, her beauty, was now the source of her greatest strength. She had become a weapon, an unstoppable force that could turn even the bravest of men to stone. The venomous snakes that had replaced her hair were no longer a symbol of weakness. They had become her guards, a constant reminder that no one could approach her without suffering the consequences. But this power, like the curse itself, was a double-edged sword. It was a strength that came at the cost of her humanity. Medusa was no longer capable of meaningful human interaction. Her existence had become one of pure solitude, a life lived on the fringes of the world, where even the gods dared not approach. The solitude that came with her curse was a heavy burden, one that weighed down on her soul. It was a constant reminder that she was not a person anymore. She was something else, something feared and despised. She had become an exile, not just from the world of mortals, but from the very essence of who she had once been. The pain of losing her identity was only exacerbated by the realization that she would never again experience love, friendship, or the simple joys of life. She was doomed to wander the island, alone, for all eternity. Yet, in her isolation, Medusa's rage began to fester. The anger she felt toward the gods, particularly Athena, became a driving force in her existence. Athena, The goddess whom Medusa had once served with such devotion had betrayed her, condemning her to a life of torment. This betrayal was the source of much of Medusa's inner turmoil. The goddess had punished her for a crime she had not committed, and Medusa could not reconcile the fact that Athena had chosen to punish her instead of Poseidon. Athena, who had been a symbol of wisdom and justice, had become a figure of tyranny and cruelty in Medusa's eyes. The sense of injustice Medusa felt was overwhelming, and it was this injustice that fueled the bitterness in her heart. No matter how much she tried to come to terms with her fate, she could not escape the feeling that she had been wronged. No, betrayed by the very goddess she had sworn to serve. Medusa's relationship with the gods was further complicated by the deep sense of powerlessness that came with her curse. The gods, who had the power to shape the fates of mortals with a single thought, had chosen to strip her of everything. They had rendered her powerless. Yet in the same breath, they had given her a weapon she could not control. The curse had been designed to make her suffer, to make her feel powerless. But in some ways, it had turned her into something formidable. She was no longer a victim in the traditional sense. She had become a force to be reckoned with. Her power to turn men into stone was absolute. She could no longer rely on her beauty or charm to get what she wanted. She no longer needed to use her physical appearance to attract attention. Her gaze was enough to send any mortal into an eternal state of immobility. The snakes that adorned her head became her silent companions, her guardians, forever watchful for any intruder who dared to approach. Yet, even with this newfound power, Medusa's suffering continued. The rage that consumed her heart did not make her any less lonely. She was a creature of fear, and fear drove others away. She could not connect with anyone, could not form the relationships that had once defined her existence. Even though she had power, she had nothing. She was trapped in a cycle of vengeance and rage, a cycle that could never bring her peace. This internal conflict, her desire for vengeance against the gods and her yearning for human connection, became the defining characteristic of her existence. She was a woman filled with the kind of sorrow that only those who have been betrayed by the divine could truly understand. In many ways, Medusa was a tragic figure, one whose very existence had become a paradox. She was both powerful and powerless, both vengeful and longing for something more. As time passed, the world around Medusa changed, but she remained the same. Her curse, like the stone statues that littered the island, became a symbol of the gods' unyielding authority over the fate of mortals. Yet, Medusa's story did not end in complete isolation, for the gods had woven her tale into the larger narrative of Greek mythology. Her story, though tragic, became a part of the cycle that would eventually lead to her meeting with the hero Perseus, a figure whose fate was irrevocably linked with her own. The curse that the gods had inflicted upon Medusa would, in a sense, lead to her redemption, though it would come at a great cost. Perseus, the son of Zeus and Danae, was tasked with slaying Medusa, and in doing so, he would put an end to her reign of terror. The myth of Medusa, with all its complexity and tragedy, would eventually lead to her death. But even in death, her legacy would live on. Her power, her vengeance, and the very nature of her curse would become integral to the mythological narrative, influencing generations of heroes, gods, and mortals who followed. The story of Medusa, however, was never just about her death. It was about the transformation she underwent, both physically and emotionally. It was about the ways in which the gods and their cruelty had the power to create and destroy, to shape the fates of mortals and immortals alike. But in Medusa's story, there was also something deeply human, a desire for justice, a yearning for connection, and profound sense of loss. Though she had been transformed into a monster, Medusa remained a symbol of what happens when the gods, in their reckless power, destroy the lives of the innocent. In the years that followed Medusa's transformation, her legend grew. What had once been the story of a beautiful priestess cast into an undeserved punishment had become a myth, woven into the fabric of Greek storytelling. The tragedy of Medusa captured the attention of many, but not for the reasons one might expect. Her tale became more than just a narrative of divine cruelty. It was a story of loss, of victimhood, and of how an individual could become something both feared and revered. The power that had been thrust upon Medusa, in the form of her deadly gaze and monstrous appearance, was a double-edged sword. While it isolated her from the world and forever condemned her to a life of solitude, it also made her an object of power, one that could not be easily dismissed. But power alone cannot fill the emptiness of a soul stripped of everything it once held dear. Medusa's life in exile became one of internal conflict, as she was caught between the monster the gods had made her and a human being who had once been full of love, beauty, and grace. In her exile on the lonely island of Sarpedon, Medusa's once glorious existence became a shadow of itself. She had been a figure of grace and beauty, admired and desired by men and gods alike. But now, in her isolated prison, she was no longer the subject of admiration. She had become a figure to be feared, a cautionary tale of the gods' wrath. The gods had robbed her of her humanity, and in doing so, they had trapped her in a cycle of sorrow and rage. Her beauty, which had once been the source of so much adoration, had now become her curse, her undoing. Her appearance, her serpentine hair, her petrifying gaze, was an image of divine punishment, and it left Medusa with little more than the bitter taste of betrayal. The isolation that Medusa experienced on the island was far more than physical. It was a psychological prison, one that kept her locked in a constant state of grief and anger. She was, in a sense, trapped between two worlds, the world she once known, full of beauty and connection, and the one she had been condemned to, where she was a solitary creature marked by her curse. Her solitude was absolute. No mortal dared approach her. Anyone who saw her face would be turned to stone, frozen in a state of terror for eternity. Even the gods themselves, with all their power, had forsaken her, leaving her alone in a place where there was no solace to be found. Medusa's mind, once sharp and filled with devotion to Athena, became clouded with sorrow and anger. The years spent in isolation only deepened her bitterness. She had been a devotee of Athena, a woman who had lived her life in service to the gods. She had been a symbol of purity, untouched by the world's vices. And yet, it was Athena herself who had cursed her, condemning her to a life of torment. This betrayal haunted Medusa, and she struggled to understand why it had happened. Why had Athena, the goddess she had loved and served, turned against her so mercilessly? It was a question that Medusa could never answer. The injustice of it all consumed her thoughts, clouding her every waking moment. Athena, a goddess of wisdom, had punished Medusa without mercy, without even considering the circumstances of her violation. It seemed incomprehensible. Why had the goddess not condemned Poseidon, the god who had wronged her, instead of the victim? Medusa's anger was not just aimed at the gods, but also at herself. She was no longer the woman she had once been. The woman who walked the earth with a sense of purpose and grace was gone, replaced by a creature who could no longer relate to the world she had once known. She had been stripped of everything that had defined her. Her beauty had been replaced with a horrific image of a monster. She could no longer walk freely among mortals. She could no longer serve the goddess she had loved. She could no longer live in peace. The very thing that had once made her special, her beauty, had become her curse. And now, Medusa was left with nothing but the desire for revenge. This longing for vengeance grew as the years passed. It was a consuming fire, one that Medusa could neither extinguish nor control. The gods had taken everything from her, and she could not forget it. She had been wronged in the most brutal way possible, and the injustice of it all fueled her rage. Medusa had no one to turn to, no one to confide in. She had become a monster in the eyes of the world, and the only thing that kept her going was a burning desire to make the gods, especially Athena, pay for what they had done to her. Her desire for revenge was, in many ways, the only thing that gave her life meaning. Without it, she would have had nothing left. She could no longer seek solace in her beauty or her service to the gods. Instead, she had to embrace her monstrous nature, using it as a weapon to destroy anyone who dared approach her. Her gaze, once a source of admiration, had become her ultimate weapon. Anyone who looked into her eyes would turn to stone. The snakes that adorned her head were no longer just a symbol of her curse. They were part of her new identity, a reminder that she was now a force to be reckoned with. She could not undo what had been done to her, but she could take control of the only thing that remained, her power. Despite this newfound power, Medusa's heart remained broken. She may have become a monster, but inside, she was still the woman who had once walked the earth with dreams and hopes of the future. The loneliness she experienced on the island was unbearable. She could no longer connect with anyone. Even though she was powerful, she was utterly alone. Her existence had become a paradox. She was both feared and invisible, a creature whose very presence invoked terror, but whose soul longed for companionship. She had become a prisoner of her own power, trapped in a cycle of rage, isolation, and sorrow. This conflict between the desire for revenge and the longing for human connection was what defined Medusa's existence. She was caught in a constant struggle between what she had become and who she had once been. The gods had taken her beauty, her humanity, and her future, and in return, they had given her the power to destroy. But what good was power when it came with such a heavy cost? Medusa's life had become a tragic irony. She was a being of immense power, yet she was powerless to change the course of her own fate. She had become a creature of vengeance, but it was a vengeance that could never bring her peace. Over time, Medusa's story became a cautionary tale, a legend passed down to the generations. Her tale was one of divine cruelty, but it was also one of profound tragedy. Medusa had once been a symbol of purity and devotion, but the gods had stripped her of everything that had given her life meaning. They had turned her into a monster, a creature of fear and destruction. And yet, in her suffering, Medusa had become something more than just a victim. She had become a symbol of the injustices that mortals often face at the hands of the gods. Her story was a reflection of the fragility of human existence, of how the whims of the gods could shape the lives of mortals in ways that were both unpredictable and cruel. Despite her transformation, Medusa's story was not one of complete destruction. Her legacy would live on, not just in the myth of her curse, but in the way that her tale resonated with others. She was not just a monster. She was a woman who had been wronged by the gods, and her story would continue to echo throughout the ages as a reminder of the dangers of divine power. Even in the depths of her isolation, Medusa's story became a part of the larger narrative of Greek mythology, one that was filled with heroes, gods, and monsters, each struggling to find meaning and purpose in a world defined by divine will. In the end, Medusa's curse would become a part of the greater mythological tapestry, a story that would continue to captivate and haunt generations to come. As Medusa's tale grew through the retelling of countless generations, her name became synonymous with tragedy and power, with suffering and strength. Though isolated on her island exile, her myth continued to circulate, woven deeply into the fabric of Greek mythology, as her transformation into a feared Gorgon remained one of the most enduring and captivating stories. Her existence was not simply a matter of vengeance, nor was it just about punishment. It became a poignant symbol of how even the divine could fall short of mercy, and how the powerless, in the face of overwhelming cruelty, could find unexpected power in their suffering. What had been a beautiful priestess of Athena had been transformed into something far more complicated than the sum of divine wrath alone, a symbol of both the vulnerability of mortals and the terrifying capriciousness of the gods. The myth of Medusa, though seemingly closed in the isolation of her island, was destined to connect to another, much larger narrative. It would intersect with the fate of Perseus, one of the most famous heroes of Greek mythology. Perseus, the son of Zeus and the mortal Danae, was a young man whose story, too, was marked by divine intervention and impossible tasks. The gods were known to frequently manipulate the fates of mortals, weaving their destinies in ways that were often unpredictable, cruel, or even tragic. Perseus was one such mortal, and his path would lead him inevitably to Medusa. Though Medusa's curse had isolated her from the world, it would eventually be this very curse that would bring her into the orbit of a hero, a young man tasked with slaying her. In the story of Perseus, we see the unfolding of Medusa's legacy in ways that might seem contradictory. Medusa, whose light had been shattered by Poseidon's assault and Athena's wrath, was now a symbol of horror, both a literal and figurative monster in the eyes of the world. To the gods and to mortals who did not understand her plight, she had become something monstrous, and her power, once a symbol of beauty and grace, now only served to enhance the fear she instilled. She was feared and avoided by all who knew of her, a creature who had once been a living being now relegated to the realm of the grotesque and the terrifying. But in the hand of Perseus, Medusa's power would take on a new dimension, one where her curse became a weapon for another's glory. For Perseus, the task of slaying Medusa was no small feat in the mythical tradition. Heroes were often given seemingly impossible quests that required them to face creatures or forces far beyond the ordinary mortal's capabilities. Medusa was one such challenge. Her very gaze could turn a man into stone, an unstoppable power that had, over the years, made her an almost invincible force. No mortal had ever successfully confronted her face to face without being turned to stone. To confront Medusa was to face death itself. And yet it was the gods, in their ever-present manipulation of mortal lives, who made this confrontation possible. The gods, particularly Athena and Hermes, provided Perseus with the tools needed to succeed in his seemingly impossible task. Athena, though the one responsible for Medusa's curse, now took on a role of guiding Perseus. She gave him a polished shield, a gift that would prove crucial in the hero's encounter with Medusa. The shield, shining with a reflective surface, would allow Perseus to look at Medusa without directly meeting her gaze, protecting him from being turned to stone. Hermes, the messenger god, gave Perseus winged sandals that would allow him to fly over great distances and, most importantly, to avoid Medusa's deadly snakes. Finally, Perseus was gifted with a sword capable of cutting through Medusa's petrified body. These tools, divine in nature, were necessary for Perseus to achieve his task, but they also highlight the gods' ongoing involvement in shaping the fates of mortals. Once again, Medusa was not simply the product of her own story, but the tool by which another's fate would be decided. When Perseus finally arrived at the Gorgon's lair, where Medusa and her sisters dwelled in isolation, he was faced with the terrifying reality of her curse. The lair, a desolate place far removed from the mortal world, was the perfect refuge for Medusa, an environment as barren as the soul she had been left with. Her sisters, though equally terrifying in their own right, were not as feared as Medusa. It was she who held the true power, the one whose gaze could change the world around her, whose mere existence had become synonymous with destruction. Yet even as Perseus approached, there was something more profound at play than simply the slaying of a monster. In this final confrontation, Medusa was not merely the object of destruction, but the focal point of an emotional and existential conflict. As Perseus stood at the entrance of Medusa's lair, shield in hand and sword at his side, he knew that what lay ahead was more than a simple battle. The hero had been sent to end Medusa's life, to sever her power once and for all. But he also understood, on some level, the tragedy that lay at the heart of her story. He was not simply confronting a monster. He was confronting a woman who had once been as human as he. Perseus may have been sent by the gods to kill Medusa, but in doing so, he would be forever tied to her fate, one that had been marked by divine manipulation, victimization, and unimaginable suffering. The moment of Medusa's death was swift and brutal, but it was not without complexity. Perseus, using the reflective shield to avoid looking directly at Medusa, approached her as she slept. The snakes that adorned her head hissed softly in the darkness, a quiet reminder of the terrible power that lay in her presence. Perseus, with his sword raised high, struck off Medusa's head, ending her reign of terror. Her death, however, did not signify the end of her story. In fact, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in Greek mythology, one where her legacy would continue to echo in ways both direct and indirect. Medusa's severed head, still capable of turning any who looked at it to stone, became one of Perseus's most powerful weapons. He carried it with him throughout his adventures, using it to defeat his enemies and protect himself. In a sense, Medusa's curse had found a new purpose, no longer a source of her own suffering, but a tool to aid the hero in his quests. It was an ironic twist of fate, one that spoke to the complexity of her existence. In death, Medusa's head also became a symbol of both power and victimhood. Though her monstrous form had been destroyed, her legacy endured, frozen in time on the edge of Perseus's shield. This head, a relic of divine cruelty, was also a symbol of profound damage that the gods could inflict on a mortal life. Medusa's story, once a tragic tale of beauty turned to horror, had become a weapon, a tool to further the causes of the gods and the heroes they manipulated. The gods had taken everything from her, but in the end, they had also given her something else entirely, a place in the mythological record, forever etched into the stories told by future generations. Perseus, in his quest to slay Medusa, had brought an end to her suffering, but he had also made her death part of his own journey. She was no longer a tragic figure, an innocent woman cursed by the gods. She had become a part of the heroic narrative, a symbol of the intersection between divine manipulation and mortal agency. Her legacy, once marked by suffering, was now intertwined with the stories of heroes, gods, and the powerful tools they wielded. Medusa's story, ultimately, is a complicated one that challenges the notion of good and evil, victim and villain. She was not simply a monster, nor was she simply a victim of divine cruelty. She was both, a being defined by her transformation, her suffering, and her newfound power. And as her tale intertwined with that of Perseus, Medusa's myth became one of the most powerful examples of how even in the darkest of curses, there could be a form of redemption, however bittersweet. The Gorgon's death did not erase the tragedy of her life, but it marked a shift in how she would be remembered. From a tragic figure, Medusa became a legend, both a warning and a symbol of the untamable forces of fate, power, and suffering that ran through the veins of Greek mythology. In the aftermath of Medusa's death, her myth continued to reverberate to the corridors of time. What had begun as a story of divine punishment and personal suffering slowly evolved into a symbol of how tragedy could birth something far greater than a simple monster. Medusa, in her death, became something more than a victim of Athena's wrath, more than a feared Gorgon. She became a symbol of the perils of beauty, the ways in which the gods' whims could twist the lives of mortals, and fragility of human identity in a world shaped by divine cruelty. She was transformed from a priestess of Athena to an isolated creature of vengeance, and in the end, she had left behind a legacy that intertwined with the very fabric of Greek mythology. Medusa's severed head, taken by Perseus as a trophy and a weapon, took on a life of its own. It became more than just a grim reminder of her curse. The head, now a powerful relic, was capable of turning anyone who gazed upon it to stone. Perseus, as he traveled through his many quests, used Medusa's head as a tool of immense power. It was the very thing that would allow him to defeat enemies who were far beyond his strength and defeat foes who had seemed invincible through the use of Medusa's head. Perseus became even more heroic, gaining not only his place in the annals of Greek mythology, but also a unique connection to the very thing that had once been a curse. But Medusa's head, in a strange twist of fate, became more than just a weapon of destruction. It also became a symbol of the intersection between power and victimhood. Even in her death, Medusa was bound to the whims of those around her. She had been used as a tool of divine retribution, then repurposed by Perseus as an instrument of his own triumph. The fact that her legacy lived on in such a way speaks to the complex, often contradictory nature of her curse. What had been a symbol of terror, of divine punishment, now became a symbol of power for a hero who had no real connection to the suffering she had endured. In the broader context of Greek mythology, Medusa's legacy serves as a poignant commentary on the ways in which the gods manipulated mortal lives. The gods in Greek mythology were known for their capriciousness, for their inability to see beyond their own desires and needs. They often shaped the fates of mortals with little to no regard for the consequences. Medusa's story is one such example. Her transformation into a Gorgon, her punishment by Athena, and her ultimate death at the hands of Perseus all point to the immense power the gods held, and the vulnerability of mortals in the face of such power. The gods were not bound by the same rules as humans. They could change the course of mortal life in an instant, and they often did so without empathy or understanding. Medusa's curse, like so many others in Greek mythology, was not one born out of any moral failing on her part, but rather one born of the gods' whims. And yet, despite the tragedy of her life and the cruelty of her transformation, Medusa's story is not one without moments of empowerment. Her gaze, once a symbol of beauty, became a weapon of fear. The very thing that had made her vulnerable, her appearance, had turned into her greatest strength. She was no longer an object to be admired. She was a force to be reckoned with. Her story embodies the idea that power is not always something bestowed upon us through strength or skill, but can also arise from the very things that once made us vulnerable. Medusa was a woman who had been betrayed by the gods, punished for a crime she had not committed, and yet she became one of the most powerful beings in Greek mythology. She had the power to turn the world to stone with a single glance, to freeze time and life itself with her gaze. But it is important to note that Medusa's power came at a great cost. It was a power that isolated her from the world. It made her into something that was both feared and despised, something that could no longer interact with others in any meaningful way. Her gaze, once an attribute of her beauty, was now a deadly weapon that kept everyone at bay. This paradox of power and isolation is one of the most striking elements of Medusa's myth. She had been transformed from a symbol of beauty to one of monstrosity, but even in her monstrous form, she remained a figure of immense strength. The irony, however, is that this power only deepened her sense of alienation. The gods had taken everything from her, but they had left her with this one thing, her power to petrify others. But even this power was not enough to fill the emptiness inside her heart. Medusa's isolation mirrored the larger themes of alienation and loss found throughout Greek mythology. Many figures in these stories, whether they were gods or mortals, found themselves exiled or cast out in some form. In Medusa's case, her curse had forced her to live alone on a remote island, where she could neither interact with others nor be part of the world she once belonged to. This isolation was perhaps the most painful aspect of her curse. She had lost her connection to her humanity, and her power, though it could destroy others, could not give her back the life she had once known. She had become both a victim of divine cruelty and a symbol of the destructive consequences of that cruelty. Her existence, as powerful as it was, remained one profound sadness and emptiness. Medusa's legacy, however, is not confined to her curse or her death. She lives on in the way her story is told and retold, in the way she continues to be a part of the larger narrative of Greek mythology. Her myth serves as a warning, a cautionary tale about the dangers of beauty, the capriciousness of the gods, and the price that must sometimes be paid for divine favor or disfavor. Her story, with all its tragedy and complexity, is a reminder of the unpredictable nature of life, of how power can be both a gift and a burden, and of the ways in which the gods shape the fates of mortals without ever truly understanding the cost of their actions. Even though Medusa's curse and her tragic fate seem to be the focus of her myth, her story also represents something larger, the human condition in its most vulnerable form. She is a victim of the gods, but she is also a symbol of human resilience and the ability to adapt, to survive, even when everything has been taken from you. Medusa's power, her transformation into a monster, and her eventual death at the hands of Perseus are all part of a much greater story about the intersection of fate, power, and humanity. Her myth suggests that, while we may not always have control over the forces that shape our lives, we do have the ability to carve out a place for ourselves in the world, even if it's one defined by tragedy. Her myth has lived on not just as a story of suffering, but as one of triumph, too, albeit a triumph of the tragic kind. Medusa's story reflects the ways in which the ancient Greeks viewed the gods as beings who were both powerful and flawed, who could act with incredible cruelty, but also who were sometimes blind to the consequences of their actions. It also speaks to the human capacity for enduring suffering and finding a way to assert one's power, even when that power seems like a curse. Medusa, in the end, became both a warning and a symbol of how beauty can become both a blessing and a curse, of how the gods can shape the destinies of mortals, and of how suffering can sometimes give rise to unexpected strength. In the final analysis, Medusa's story transcends her identity as a monster or victim. Her myth has become an enduring symbol of the complexities of power, beauty, and fate. The tragedy of Medusa's life and the power of her gaze has made her a figure of fascination and intrigue for centuries. She is a reminder that even in the darkest of curses, there can be a strength, a legacy that outlives the suffering. Medusa, in her death, became something far more than just the sum of her curse. She became a symbol of the ways in which power, victimhood, and tragedy can collide to create something both terrible and awe-inspiring, something that continues to captivate and challenge us to this day. The myth of Medusa is a tangled one, bound not only by the threads of her punishment and death, but also by the deeper, far-reaching implications of her transformation. When we think of Medusa, what often comes to mind is her monstrous visage, the snakes that replace her hair, the curse that makes her a terrifying figure, and the curse's ultimate consequences, her death at the hands of Perseus. Yet, her myth is not just a story of a woman turned monster, nor is it simply a tale of divine cruelty and revenge. It is also a complex exploration of the human condition, of the price of beauty, of transformation, and the ways in which stories about the gods, mortals, and monsters intersect. Medusa's tale, tragic and cruel as it is, carries with profound insights into themes of victimhood, power, beauty, vengeance, and fate. But perhaps most importantly, it raises essential questions about the relationship between the divine and the mortal, about how one individual's suffering can ripple out to affect countless others, and how myths can transform a singular figure into something universal. When the gods of Greek mythology acted, they often did so with little regard for human lives that would be irrevocably affected by their decisions. Medusa's transformation was an act of divine cruelty that erased the person she once was, leaving her only with a monstrous form that would both haunt and isolate her for eternity. The gods, with all their power, were quick to impose their will on mortals, and the punishment of Medusa was no different. It wasn't just that she had been turned into a Gorgon, cursed to live in isolation, feared by all. It was that the gods' whims, their capriciousness, had forever altered the course of her life, reducing her from a priestess of Athena to a creature of terror. Athena's role in Medusa's curse is significant in understanding the dynamics between the gods and mortals. Athena, a goddess of wisdom and strategy, was often portrayed as a figure of justice and fairness. But in Medusa's case, her intervention was anything but just. Medusa, after being assaulted by Poseidon in Athena's temple, was punished not for the violation itself, but for what Athena perceived as a desecration of her temple. Medusa, the victim, became the scapegoat, punished not by Poseidon but by the very goddess she had served with devotion. This betrayal is at the heart of Medusa's tragedy. What makes her story so powerful is not simply the fact of her punishment, but the nature of that punishment. Medusa had not been the instigator of her own downfall. She had been violated, and yet she was the one who suffered the consequences. This inversion of justice, punishing the victim instead of the perpetrator, echoes throughout many other myths and stories of divine intervention in Greek mythology. In the case of Medusa, however, the divine punishment didn't end with her transformation. It continued throughout her existence, a constant reminder of the gods' unchecked power over mortals. Medusa's life became a story not just of victimhood, but of the cruelty of divine rule, where the whims of the gods shaped lives in ways that were both arbitrary and devastating. The isolation that Medusa experienced after her transformation is perhaps one of the most poignant aspects of her story. In the island exile to which she was sent, Medusa was not just physically removed from society. She was emotionally and psychologically cut off from everything she had once known. The life she had known before, one of beauty, service, and connection with the world, was replaced by a life of loneliness, solitude, and, perhaps most tragically, alienation. Her beauty, which had once been a source of admiration, had now become her curse, and her very existence was now defined by a horrifying appearance. No one could approach her without fear, and Medusa's gaze, once something that symbolized her allure, had become something that could instantly freeze anyone in their tracks. It was a terrible, ironic reversal. The woman who had once been the object of desire was now a figure of fear, rejected by the world she once belonged to. Her curse was not just a physical transformation, but an emotional and psychological one as well. The punishment Athena had imposed on her had robbed Medusa of everything that once gave her identity and purpose. The priestess who had been devoted to Athena, the woman whose beauty had drawn the gaze of gods and mortals alike, was now reduced to a creature that no one could approach, a figure so repulsive that she could no longer engage with any other being in a meaningful way. The transformation from a beloved mortal to an isolated monster was not merely a physical one. It was also a transformation of Medusa's soul. She was no longer the woman who had walked in the world with a sense of grace and dignity. She had been turned into something that could no longer experience the joys of life, the pleasures of human connection. She was no longer a person, but a living representation of vengeance, of divine cruelty, and of loss. Even as Medusa was forced into this isolation, she became a figure of legend. The power of her curse, the terror it inspired, and the enduring tragedy of her fate combined to create a narrative that transcended her personal suffering. Medusa's tale would go on to inspire countless stories, plays, and works of art. Her transformation into a Gorgon became more than just a myth of divine punishment. It became a story of how power and vulnerability could intertwine, how victimhood could become a source of immense strength, and how beauty could turn into something terrifying and uncontrollable. The beauty that had once been her strength became the very source of her misery. Yet, in the isolation and the bitterness that followed, Medusa's pain also became the wellspring of her power. Her gaze, the thing that once symbolized her fragility, became the thing that could turn anyone to stone. Her transformation was complete. From prey to predator, from victim to monstrous force. And yet, This power could not give her back what she had lost. It could not undo the cruelty of the gods, nor could it fill the emptiness of her soul. Medusa's death at the hands of Perseus marks the end of her direct involvement in Greek mythology. But even in her death, Medusa's legacy lived on. Perseus, the hero chosen by the gods to end her reign of terror, would carry Medusa's severed head with him on his adventures. The head, still capable of turning anyone who gazed upon it to stone, became a weapon of unimaginable power. Perseus used it to defeat enemies and accomplish feats that would have otherwise been beyond him. But even in this moment, Medusa's curse was not truly ended. The gods had taken everything from her, but in death, they turned her into an instrument of heroism. The very thing that had once been her suffering, her petrifying gaze, became a tool in the hands of a hero who had no understanding of her tragedy. Perseus's use of Medusa's head was an ironic twist of fate. The gods had turned her into a monster, yet now she had become an object that served the very heroes who would celebrate their victories at her expense. The tragic irony of Medusa's existence lay in the fact that even after death, she was a pawn in the hands of the gods, used by mortals for their gain, her suffering no longer acknowledged or understood. Despite the way her legacy was manipulated, Medusa's myth continues to serve as a powerful reflection on the nature of power, victimhood, and vengeance. She was a figure who had been wronged by the gods, and yet, in her isolation, she found a way to survive, to gain power, and to leave behind a legacy. Her transformation from priestess to Gorgon symbolizes the ways in which individuals can be defined by their suffering, how suffering can shape identity, and how power can emerge from the darkest of places. Medusa was no longer a victim in the traditional sense, but she was still a tragic figure, defined by the gods' cruelty, a figure whose story spoke to the broader questions of justice, fate, and divine interference in the lives of mortals. Medusa's story continues to haunt us because it speaks to the complexity of human experience. She was not simply a monster, but a woman who had once lived in the world with grace and beauty, a woman whose life was destroyed by forces far beyond her control. She was a victim of divine intervention, but she was also a symbol of resilience, of the way in which the human spirit can endure even the most crushing of circumstances. In the end, Medusa's myth teaches us something essential about the nature of power and victimhood, about the ways in which those who are wrong can still, in some way, shape their own fate, even if it's through the most tragic means. Medusa was not just a myth of horror, but one of hope, however twisted it might be. Her curse, her power, and her legacy remain a testament to the enduring human struggle against forces greater than ourselves. Medusa's myth, as tragic and horrific as it is, serves as a narrative that stretches far beyond the confines of her transformation and death. It is not just a story of divine retribution or victimhood, but one that continues to resonate with us for its complex exploration of themes like the abuse of power, the dehumanization of individuals, and the way in which individuals' lives are shaped by forces beyond their control. Through Medusa, we see how beauty, power, and victimhood can be intertwined, how these elements can coexist and create something far more devastating than any of them alone. While Medusa's story has been told and retold in various forms, each telling highlights new aspects of her character, each pointing to a larger, more universal story about the human condition. Medusa's transformation into a monster is central to understanding the broader themes in her myth. Before her punishment by Athena, Medusa was a beautiful woman, one whose beauty was renowned across the mortal world. This beauty, however, was both a gift and a curse. In Greek mythology, beauty was often seen as a double-edged sword, something that could bring favor and admiration, but also jealousy, envy, and danger. Medusa's beauty, in fact, was a thing that made her vulnerable to the gods. The gods often punished those who were beautiful, seeing them either as objects to be coveted or as figures who could disrupt the balance of divine and mortal relations. Medusa's beauty, coupled with her position as a temple priestess dedicated to Athena, made her an ideal target for Poseidon's lust. When he assaulted her in Athena's temple, the punishment was swift and brutal, but it was not Poseidon who faced any consequence. Instead, Medusa, the victim, bore the brunt of the god's wrath. Athena, unable or unwilling to hold Poseidon accountable, placed a curse upon Medusa, turning her into a Gorgon. This transformation, however, was not just a physical one. Medusa's curse was not simply that she became a monster. It was the isolation and dehumanization that accompanied it. No longer could Medusa walk among the very people who had once admired her beauty. Her transformation into a monster, symbolized by her hair of snakes and her deadly gaze, marked her as something wholly other, something to be feared, not loved. Her appearance was not just a grotesque image. It was a reflection of her inner torment, her loss of selfhood, and the tragedy of being a victim of divine cruelty. Where once she had been a person, now she was a force of nature, capable of petrifying anyone who dared to meet her eyes. It is this loss of identity, this stripping away of everything that made her human, that lies at the heart of her tragedy. Medusa's life on the island of Sarpedon, where she was exiled after her transformation, is often portrayed as one of utter loneliness and despair. She was surrounded by no one but her sisters, the other Gorgons, who were similarly cursed. Despite this, Medusa's story was different from her sisters. While they were monstrous in their own right, they were not cursed with the same deadly power. It was Medusa who bore the full brunt of the gods' anger, and it was her who became a symbol of horror. As the years passed, Medusa's curse became her identity. She was no longer just a woman. She was a monster, a figure defined by her curse. And yet, beneath the snakes, beneath the stone gaze, there remained the traces of the woman she had once been, a woman who had been wronged by the gods and robbed of her humanity. Her isolation only deepened this sense of loss. Medusa was trapped in an emotional prison, much as she was physically confined to the island. The gods had given her the power to turn others to stone, but they had taken away her ability to connect with others. She could not converse, could not form relationships, could not experience the warmth of human touch. Instead, her very presence caused death. Every encounter was one of destruction. Her life had become defined by an endless cycle of loneliness, bitterness, and regret. The punishment she had endured was not simply the curse that altered her form. It was the emotional and psychological toll that came with it. Her beauty, which had once been her greatest asset, had become her greatest enemy. The same beauty that had once drawn people to her was now the thing that separated her from them, making her a figure to be avoided at all costs. Medusa's emotional state was undoubtedly complex. She was caught in a constant struggle between her past and her present. She was no longer the woman who had once served Athena, who had once lived a life full of beauty and grace. She was now a monster, an outcast, an object of fear and revulsion. But even in this monstrosity, there remained a core humanity within her, a human being who had been wronged, who had suffered unjustly, and who was now, in her twisted form, seeking vengeance. Her transformation into a monster was not a voluntary one. It was something that had been thrust upon her by the gods, and it was this sense of being forced into something she could not control that likely fueled her anger and desire for revenge. The isolation she experienced was not just physical. It was psychological. Medusa had been abandoned by the gods and had been left to suffer in solitude for years. She had been punished for something she had not chosen, and this injustice would forever shape her relationship with the divine. The arrival of Perseus on the island of Sarpedon marked a turning point in Medusa's story. Perseus, a hero sent by the gods to slay her, was the embodiment of the gods' manipulation of mortal lives. Though the gods had cursed Medusa, they now called upon Perseus to end her suffering. The gods had given Perseus the tools he needed to defeat her: a polished shield, winged sandals, and a sword that could sever her head. Yet, even in this moment of death, there is a tragic irony. Perseus, in killing Medusa, was not only ending her life, he was also sealing her fate as a weapon for the gods. Medusa, once a victim of divine cruelty, was now turned into an instrument of power, an object that could be used for the glory of heroes. Her severed head, still capable of turning others to stone, became a powerful tool in the hands of Perseus. And so, Medusa's legacy continued, but it was no longer her own. It was now part of a larger narrative, one in which she was no longer the tragic figure, but a tool in the hands of those who had never truly understood her suffering. Even in death, Medusa's story was not one of release or redemption. Her head, severed by Perseus, became an object of great power, used by the hero in his subsequent quests. In this way, Medusa's suffering did not cease with her death. Instead, it became a tool for others to wield. Perseus, in using her head, was not just performing an act of heroism, He was also continuing the cycle of divine manipulation that had plagued Medusa's life. She had been manipulated by the gods from the beginning, and even in death, her image continued to be manipulated for the benefit of mortals. In a strange and ironic twist, Medusa's curse had transformed from a source of personal torment into a symbol of power for Perseus. And yet, this was no real victory for Medusa. Her death did not mark the end of her pain. It marked the continuation of her existence as an object to be used by others. Medusa's myth is filled with contradictions, ironies, and layers of meaning. She is at once a victim, a villain, a symbol of power, and a figure of tragedy. She embodies the complexity of the human condition, where pain, power, and vulnerability are often intertwined in ways that are difficult to comprehend. In the end, her story is one of immense suffering, but it is also one of resilience and the enduring power of myth. Medusa's legacy is one that has endured for centuries, capturing the imagination of countless generations. Her transformation into a monster, her isolation, and her eventual death at the hands of Perseus continue to speak to the ways in which individuals can be shaped by forces beyond their control, be it divine, social, or personal. Medusa's myth is a reminder that no matter how much power one possesses, no matter how much beauty or strength one may have, the forces that govern life are often beyond our comprehension or control. And it is in the face of these forces that the human spirit must find a way to endure. Medusa's tragedy is not simply that she became a monster. It is that she was made a monster by the gods, stripped of her humanity, and left to suffer in isolation. But even in this suffering, she has left behind a legacy that continues to haunt us, a legacy that reminds us of the fragility of life, the unpredictability of fate, and the ways in which we are all shaped by the forces beyond our control. Medusa's story has endured across centuries, and with each retelling, the layers of her myth have grown ever more complex. On the surface, hers is a tale of divine punishment and personal suffering, yet beneath this narrative lies a deeper exploration of themes such as justice, beauty, power, and transformation. What began as a tragedy born of betrayal and anger has, over time, evolved into a multifaceted story that speaks to both human vulnerability and resilience. Medusa's transformation from a revered priestess into a feared and tragic figure serves as a powerful commentary on the unpredictable and often cruel nature of divine influence, as well as the ways in which power and victimhood intersect. When we consider Medusa's punishment, it becomes clear that she was not merely a casualty of divine retribution, but a symbol of something much greater. Her beauty, which had once been her greatest asset, was the very thing that led to her downfall. Beauty, in Greek mythology, was a powerful force, something that convoked both admiration and envy. Medusa's beauty was so striking that it caught the attention of Poseidon, one of the most powerful gods in the pantheon. However, what made her vulnerable to him was not just her beauty, but the fact that she was a priestess of Athena, sworn to celibacy and chastity. This connection to Athena, a goddess known for her wisdom and strategic insight, is significant because it highlights the injustice that Medusa faced. She was punished not for her actions, but for the violation of a sacred space, Athena's temple. Despite being the victim of Poseidon's violence, Medusa was made to bear the brunt of the punishment, with no recourse or defense. The curse placed upon Medusa by Athena is one of the most tragic aspects of her story. Athena's decision to turn Medusa into a Gorgon, a creature with snakes for her hair and a gaze that could turn anyone to stone, was not just a transformation of her physical form. It was a stripping away of her humanity. The once beautiful woman who had been admired and adored became something monstrous, something feared by all who cross her path. Her transformation into a Gorgon symbolizes the way in which beauty and power are often inextricably linked in the world of the gods, and how that power can be both a blessing and a curse. For Medusa, beauty had been both her greatest strength and her greatest vulnerability, and in this curse, Athena sought to remove her beauty in a way that would leave her isolated, alienated, and feared. But the curse was not just about Medusa's appearance. It was about the consequences of divine judgment and the absence of mercy. In the world of Greek mythology, the gods were known for their capriciousness, for their tendency to mete out punishment without regard for consequences or the fairness of their decisions. Medusa's plight is a prime example of this. Athena's actions were not motivated by a sense of justice, but rather by anger and a desire to protect her own reputation. She punished Medusa not because of any wrongdoing on Medusa's part, but because Medusa had been the victim of a god's desire. This lack of empathy from Athena, who should have been the very embodiment of wisdom and fairness, underscores a cruelty that often defined the actions of the gods. Medusa's exile to the remote island of Sarpedon was not simply a punishment for her transformation. It was also a sentence of solitude and despair. Forced to live in isolation, far from the world she had once been a part of, Medusa's curse was compounded by her complete severance from human society. The island, dark and barren, became a reflection of the emotional and psychological desolation that Medusa experienced. She was no longer a woman with dreams, aspirations, or a sense of belonging. She was a creature of terror, a being whose very existence was defined by her ability to turn others to stone. The snakes that covered her head were not just physical manifestations of her curse. They were symbolic of the entrapment she felt, the way in which she had been transformed from a figure of beauty into a figure of horror. It is important to understand that Medusa was not a villain in the traditional sense. She had been turned into a monster by the gods, and her actions were a consequence of the curse they had imposed upon her. Medusa was not evil. She was a victim of divine cruelty. Yet, over time, her transformation into a Gorgon became a symbol of fear and violence. People who encountered Medusa did not see a woman who had been wronged, a woman whose life had been stolen from her by the gods. They saw a monster, a figure of death and destruction. In this way, Medusa's tragedy became even more profound. Not only had she been denied her humanity, but she had been reduced to a symbol of terror, something to be avoided at all costs. The snakes that adorned Medusa's head were perhaps the most striking feature of her new form, and they have been interpreted in various ways over time. In many depictions, the snakes are portrayed as a symbol of Medusa's transformation from a beautiful woman into a monster, and they serve as a visual representation of the curse she has been given. However, the snakes also represent something deeper. They symbolize the way in which Medusa's identity had been consumed by the gods and by her own suffering. The snakes are not just a feature of her appearance. They are a manifestation of the emotional and psychological turmoil that Medusa endured. She was a woman whose inner turmoil had been externalized into a grotesque form. The very essence of her identity had been transformed into something that others would fear, and this fear was a direct consequence of the gods' actions. Medusa's curse also represents a larger commentary on the intersection of power, beauty, and victimhood. Throughout Greek mythology, beauty was often depicted as a double-edged sword. For some, it was a gift that brought admiration and adoration. For others, like Medusa, it was a vulnerability that could lead to their downfall. Medusa's beauty had once been a source of strength for her, but it became her undoing. It attracted the attention of Poseidon, a god whose desires could not be denied, and it also brought the wrath of Athena, a goddess who could not tolerate the perceived violation of her temple. Medusa's beauty, in essence, was a source of power for her. But in the world of the gods, power was not always protection. It could easily become a weapon to be wielded against her. Medusa's story is also a reflection of the ways in which the gods often acted out of selfishness and vengeance, rather than justice or compassion. The gods in Greek mythology were known for their inability to look beyond their own desires and emotions. Athena's decision to punish Medusa was not one of reason or fairness. It was one of anger and jealousy. Poseidon's assault on Medusa was a reminder that the gods could violate mortals without consequence, while Medusa was made to bear the punishment. In this way, Medusa's life serves as a tragic reminder of the ways in which the powerful often prey upon the vulnerable, and how the gods, in their infinite power, were often indifferent to the suffering of mortals. As time went on, Medusa's story evolved, and her myth took on new meanings. Though she was a tragic figure, her transformation also imbued her with power, something that could not be taken away. Medusa became a figure of revenge, a woman whose curse had been turned into a weapon. Her ability to turn others to stone, once a source of pain, became a means of power. In a strange way, Medusa's curse became a form of retribution for the gods' cruelty, as her gaze could now destroy anyone who dared to approach her. This transformation was a reflection of the ways in which suffering could sometimes breed strength, how the darkest of circumstances could lead to a new form of power. Despite the irony of her newfound power, Medusa remained a tragic figure. She had been a victim of divine cruelty, and in the end, She became a tool for Perseus, a hero sent by the gods to end her life. Perseus' quest to slay Medusa was a culmination of a larger narrative, one in which Medusa's suffering was ultimately used for the benefit of others. Perseus used Medusa's head as a weapon, carrying it with him on his adventures and using it to defeat his enemies. Even in death, Medusa's curse did not end. She was now a part of Perseus' heroic narrative, her suffering and power used for his glory. Medusa's myth, in the end, serves as a poignant reflection of the complexities of power, beauty, and victimhood. She was not simply a monster. She was a woman who had been wronged by the gods, whose life had been destroyed by forces beyond her control. Her story is one of immense tragedy, but it is also one of strength and resilience. Medusa's legacy, though rooted in suffering, has endured for centuries, serving as a reminder of the ways in which divine intervention can shape lives, how beauty and power can be both a blessing and a curse, and how individuals can find strength even in the darkest of circumstances. The story of Medusa is a story of loss, transformation, and the enduring impact of fate. It is a story that continues to resonate with us, offering a powerful commentary on the human condition and the forces that shape our lives. Medusa's myth is one that has been told and retold for centuries, each retelling imbuing it with new layers of meaning. Her transformation from a beautiful priestess into a monster who could turn men to stone is both tragic and compelling. However, her myth is more than just a cautionary tale of divine punishment and suffering. It also speaks to deeper truths about human nature, power, beauty, and the vulnerability that comes with them. In many ways, Medusa is a reflection of the darker sides of humanity, but she is also a symbol of the strength that can arise from victimhood and the unexpected ways in which power can manifest. One of the most profound aspects of Medusa's story is the relationship between beauty and vulnerability. In Greek mythology, beauty was often depicted as a powerful force, one that could bring admiration, love, or even divine favor. However, it also had a darker side. Beauty could provoke envy, jealousy, and rage, especially when it was coupled with the vulnerability that came with being admired by the gods. Medusa's beauty, once seen as a gift, ultimately became the thing that led to her undoing. It was not just her physical beauty that made her vulnerable, but the fact that she was a mortal living in a world dominated by gods. In a society where the gods were both omnipotent and capricious, the line between admiration and destruction was thin. Medusa's beauty, which had drawn the attention of both Poseidon and Athena, became a double-edged sword, one that ultimately condemned her to a fate of horror and isolation. Medusa's curse is the central tragedy of her story. Athena, a goddess of wisdom and justice, punished Medusa for a crime she did not commit. When Poseidon raped Medusa in Athena's temple, the punishment for the crime should have fallen upon Poseidon, the true violator. Instead, Athena, in her anger and desire to protect the sanctity of her temple, took her wrath out on Medusa. This decision highlights the often arbitrary nature of divine justice in Greek mythology. Medusa's transformation from a beautiful woman into a Gorgon was not a result of her own actions, but of the decisions made by the gods. She was punished for being the victim, and this injustice forms the core of her tragedy. Athena's decision to curse Medusa was such a horrific transformation, the turning of her hair into snakes and her gaze into stone, was both an act of cruelty and a reflection of the gods' disregard for the lives of mortals. The gods, in many ways, were detached from the suffering of those they controlled, and Medusa's fate was an example of how divine beings could manipulate human lives without ever truly understanding the consequences of their actions. Medusa's exile to the island of Sarpedon marked the beginning of her complete separation from the world. The island became a metaphor for her emotional and psychological isolation. No longer able to interact with others in any meaningful way, Medusa was forced to live alone in a place that mirrored her internal state, lonely, desolate, and cut off from the world she once knew. She had once been a priestess of Athena, a figure who had enjoyed the reverence and respect of people. But now she was a pariah, a creature whose very existence was a symbol of terror. The snakes that replaced her hair were not just physical symbols of her curse. They were representations of the emotional turmoil that Medusa had to endure. Her life was defined by the pain of being rejected, by the feeling that she had been abandoned by the gods and forsaken by the world. Medusa's transformation was not just a physical change. It was also a profound psychological and emotional shift. Before the curse, Medusa had been a woman of beauty and grace, living a life of devotion to Athena. However, after the curse, she was no longer the woman she had once been. She had been stripped of her humanity, reduced to a creature of terror who could no longer experience the joys of human connection. The woman who had once been admired for her beauty was now feared for the very thing that had once made her beautiful. Her gaze. Her beauty, once a source of admiration, had been transformed into a curse that turned her into a monster. And yet, in this transformation, Medusa's sense of self remained. She was still the woman who had been punished unjustly by the gods, still the woman who had been violated by Poseidon, still the woman who had been cast aside by Athena. The very thing that had once made her vulnerable, her beauty, had become her source of strength. In a cruel twist of fate, her beauty had transformed into the most terrifying weapon at her disposal. The fact that Medusa's beauty had been weaponized is deeply ironic. The gods had punished her for something that was beyond her control, and in the process, they had created a monster who could destroy those who dared to look upon her. The punishment, in a sense, had turned Medusa into both a victim and a force of vengeance. Despite her transformation into a monster, Medusa's story is not just one of suffering. It is also a story of survival and resistance. Her isolation, while painful, also gave her the opportunity to become something greater than the victim of the gods' wrath. In her solitude, Medusa learned to embrace the power that had been forced upon her. She was no longer just a woman who had been punished. She was a creature who could wield the power of life and death with a single glance. She had been turned into a weapon by the gods, but in her exile, she learned to control that weapon, turning it into a means of asserting her own power. Medusa's ability to turn others to stone became a form of self-protection. No longer could she be the helpless victim. In a world that had abandoned her, Medusa learned to protect herself, to use the very curse that had been placed upon her to her advantage. The monsters who now surrounded her, her sisters, who shared in her curse, also became part of her resistance. Together, they lived in isolation, but they were not helpless. Medusa's story is thus one of resilience in the face of adversity. Even though she had been forced into a monstrous form by the gods, she had not been entirely destroyed. She had learned to adapt to her new reality, finding strength in the very thing that had once been a source of her vulnerability. The arrival of Perseus, however, marked the end of Medusa's independence. The hero, sent by the gods to slay her, was part of a larger pattern of divine manipulation. Perseus, despite his heroism, was no more than an instrument of the gods' will. He did not seek Medusa out of a desire for justice, nor did he act out of any sense of moral righteousness. He was simply carrying out the will of the gods. Perseus's quest to slay Medusa, while heroic, was also an act of obedience to the divine order. His mission was to use Medusa's head as a weapon, an object that would allow him to defeat other enemies on his journey. The fact that Medusa's death was turned into a weapon to be used for the benefit of Perseus underscores the tragic irony of her life. Her curse, which had begun as a punishment, was now an instrument of power for someone else. Even in her death, Medusa was reduced to an object, a tool in the hands of those who had never truly understood her suffering. Yet in death, Medusa's legacy did not end. Her severed head, still capable of turning those who gaze upon it to stone, continued to have immense power. Perseus used the head to defeat his enemies, including the monstrous Titan Atlas. However, the use of Medusa's head for heroic purposes only highlights the ongoing tragedy of her myth. Medusa had been reduced to a symbol of power, her suffering forgotten by those who sought to use her for their own gain. She was no longer a victim, but a tool for others to wield. Medusa's myth is, in many ways, a reflection of the larger themes of Greek mythology, where the gods' power over mortals was absolute and the consequences of their whims could be devastating. Medusa's curse was a direct result of the gods' inability to understand the full impact of their actions. Athena, in punishing Medusa, never considered the emotional toll it would take on the woman who had once been her devotee. In the end, Medusa's story serves as a stark reminder of the capricious nature of divine justice and the vulnerability of mortals in a world shaped by the gods. Her myth also highlights the complexities of beauty and power, and the ways in which vulnerability can lead to both destruction and strength. The legacy of Medusa, however, is not confined to her curse. Over the centuries, Medusa has been reimagined in countless ways. In some versions of the myth, She is portrayed as a tragic figure, a woman wronged by the gods and left to suffer in isolation. In others, she is a symbol of empowerment, a woman who has taken control of her fate and turned her curse into a weapon. Medusa's myth speaks to the ways in which stories evolve and how they reflect the changing values and beliefs of society. She has become both a figure of horror and a symbol of resilience, a woman who embodies both the victim and the victor. Her myth continues to resonate with us today, as it speaks to universal themes of power, justice, and the ways in which we are shaped by forces beyond our control. Medusa's story, in all its complexity, challenges us to think about the nature of suffering and the unexpected ways in which we can find strength in the face of adversity. Her legacy is one of tragedy, but it is also one of survival, a reminder that even in the darkest Medusa's myth, like many Greek myths, is not merely a tale of divine retribution or tragic victimhood. It is also a reflection of the way in which power, beauty, and fate intertwine to shape the lives of individuals. The story of Medusa is more than just a story of a woman turned monster. It is a meditation on the complexity of justice, the arbitrariness of divine action, and the consequences of beauty in a world governed by the gods. At its core, the myth of Medusa asks us to question the nature of victimhood, power, and transformation. Through Medusa, we are forced to grapple with the stark realities of how power structures, both divine and societal, shape human lives, often with devastating consequences. Her life and death reflect the crushing weight of fate, the callousness of the gods, and the cruelty of being judged and punished by forces that have no understanding of the intricacies of human experience. One of the central aspects of Medusa's story is the role of beauty in shaping her fate. Beauty in Greek mythology was often depicted as something to be admired and worshipped. It was a powerful force that could bring favor from the gods, but it could also provoke jealousy, anger, and violence. Medusa, with her captivating beauty, had the potential to wield great power, but this very beauty ultimately became her downfall. Her beauty attracted the attention of Poseidon, one of the most powerful gods in the Greek pantheon. However, it wasn't just that Medusa was beautiful. It was that she was vulnerable. She was immortal in a world filled with gods who were driven by their desires, passions, and whims. This dynamic between beauty and vulnerability is critical to understanding the tragedy of Medusa's fate. Medusa's beauty, which should have been a blessing, became a curse. It was a magnet for the attention of powerful gods, and ultimately, it made her a target for their desires. What makes Medusa's story even more tragic is the fact that her victimhood was compounded by the lack of justice she received. After Poseidon assaulted Medusa in Athena's temple, the punishment that followed was not directed at Poseidon, the perpetrator, but at Medusa, the victim. This inversion of justice highlights a central flaw in the relationship between the gods and mortals in Greek mythology. The gods were not concerned with true justice or fairness. Instead, their actions were often driven by personal emotions, jealousy, anger, and revenge, rather than a sense of moral rectitude. Athena, in particular, demonstrated a profound lack of empathy. Rather than punishing Poseidon for violating her temple, she chose to punish Medusa. Medusa, who had been assaulted and violated, was further punished for the crime of being the victim. This act of divine cruelty turned Medusa's life upside down. She was transformed into a creature feared by all, her beauty replaced by snakes, and her gaze made so deadly that anyone who looked at her would be turned to stone. The curse imposed by Athena not only destroyed Medusa's life, but also stripped her of her humanity. She was no longer a woman with a future, with relationships and a sense of belonging. Instead, she was transformed into something else entirely, a monster. She was no longer a person, but an object of terror. The curse that Athena placed upon her was not merely a physical transformation. It was a complete dehumanization. Medusa was no longer capable of experiencing the things that made her human: love, companionship, connection, and hope. The physical manifestation of this dehumanization was the snakes that replaced her hair, a symbol of her inner torment, and a deadly gaze that had once been a symbol of her allure but was now a weapon of destruction. But beyond the physical aspects of her transformation, it is Medusa's emotional and psychological journey that deepens the tragedy of her myth. The emotional toll of being cursed by the gods is perhaps the most devastating aspect of Medusa's story. She was forced into exile on the island of Sarpedon, where she was cut off from the world she had once known. No longer could she interact with others. No longer could she experience the joys of life. Her beauty, which had once brought her admiration, had now become her curse. She could no longer be the object of love or desire. She had become an object of fear and revulsion. In this forced isolation, Medusa's humanity was stripped away, and she was left to grapple with the emotional and psychological consequences of her curse. The pain of being abandoned by the gods, of being punished for a crime she had not committed, and of being forced to live in a state of perpetual loneliness, all contributed to Medusa's transformation. Her exile became a symbol of the ultimate punishment, not just physical torment, but emotional annihilation. Medusa's heart and soul were broken, and her isolation was as much a part of her curse as the snakes that replace her hair. In many ways, Medusa's exile reflects a broader theme of the powerlessness of mortals in the face of divine authority. In Greek mythology, the gods were all-powerful, and mortals had little to no recourse when they were wronged. Medusa's story is a reflection of this harsh reality. She had no agency in the matter of her transformation. She was a victim of divine whim. She was punished not for any wrongdoing on her part, but for the actions of a god and the jealousy of another. In this way, Medusa's plight speaks to the helplessness of mortals in a world dominated by gods who acted according to their own emotions and desires. Medusa had been transformed into a monster, forced to live in isolation and cut off from human society. The gods' disregard for her suffering, her emotional and psychological pain, underscores a callousness with which the gods treated mortals. Medusa's suffering was not just physical. It was psychological and emotional, and it was this suffering that made her a tragic figure. Medusa's curse was not just an act of divine punishment. It was also an act of transformation. Her transformation into a Gorgon marked the point at which she ceased to be a mortal woman and became something else entirely. She became a creature whose power lay in her ability to turn others to stone with a single glance. The very thing that had once been her beauty, her gaze, had now become a weapon of unimaginable power. This transformation, however, was not an empowerment in the traditional sense. While it gave Medusa the ability to defend herself, to protect herself from others, it also isolated her further. The gaze that had once drawn people to her was now a source of destruction. She could no longer form relationships, could no longer experience love or companionship. Her power, while immense, had no outlet except for the destruction of those who came too close. In many ways, this transformation mirrored the emotional toll of her curse. Just as she had been stripped of her human relationships, she was now stripped of the ability to form any new ones. The power that had been forced upon her could not restore the connections that had been taken away. Medusa's curse, while it made her powerful, also left her eternally alone. As time passed, Medusa's myth evolved. While her transformation was undoubtedly tragic, her story also became one of resistance and survival. In the isolation of her exile, Medusa came to embody a new kind of power. She had been forced into a monstrous form by the gods, but in that form, she found a way to survive. Her ability to turn others to stone was no longer just a curse. It was a means of survival, a way for her to protect herself from the world that had abandoned her. Medusa's gaze, once a symbol of beauty, was now a tool of defense. In a strange way, her curse had empowered her. It allowed her to claim a form of agency that had been denied to her when she was a victim of the gods' whims. The arrival of Perseus, however, marked a turning point in Medusa's story. Perseus, a hero sent by the gods, was tasked with slaying Medusa. His mission, though seemingly noble, was part of a larger pattern of divine manipulation. Perseus, like many other heroes in Greek mythology, was sent to accomplish a task not out of any sense of justice, but because the gods had chosen him. The gods did not care about the morality of Medusa's situation. They only cared about the completion of Perseus's mission. In slaying Medusa, Perseus was not performing a heroic act of justice. He was simply doing the bidding of the gods. Medusa's death, while it ended her physical existence, did not end her suffering. Even in death, she was turned into a tool for others to wield. Perseus, in using her severed head to defeat his enemies, perpetuated the cycle of her exploitation. Medusa, the victim of divine cruelty, had been reduced to a weapon in the hands of others. Her suffering, though it had come to an end, continued to be used for the benefit of others. Medusa's myth is a complex one, filled with layers of meaning that reflect the intricate relationships between power, beauty, victimhood, and survival. Her story challenges us to think about the nature of justice, about how power is distributed, and about the consequences of divine intervention in the lives of mortals. Medusa was not merely a monster. She was a woman who had been wronged by the gods, a woman who had been punished for a crime she did not commit, and a woman who had been stripped of her humanity. Her transformation into a Gorgon was not just a physical change. It was a loss of self, an emotional and psychological rupture that left her alone, isolated, and powerless in a world dominated by forces far beyond her control. In the end, Medusa's myth is a reflection of the larger patterns of cruelty, injustice, and manipulation that characterize the world of the gods in Greek mythology. Her story is a reminder of the ways in which the powerful can manipulate the powerless, and how even the most tragic figures can become symbols of both victimhood and resistance. The legacy of Medusa is one that has endured for centuries, speaking to us across the ages about the complexities of beauty, power, and fate.